The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, reducing the soft costs of solar. My guest today is Mike Casey. He is the CEO of Tigercomm. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tim. Appreciate it.
You and Yann Brandt wrote a wonderful little article recently in PV Magazine, so our listeners can check that out, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes about reducing the soft cost and why this is such an important opportunity economically for the United States. Obviously, we are also in the midst of a major infrastructure bill going on in Washington, D.C., which is also relevant to this discussion. But before we dive into the discussion about solar and soft costs, Mike, please give our listeners some background on yourself. How did you get into the renewables industries, and what is it that Tigercomm does?
Sure. Well, I'll take the last part first. And my firm is the top MarCom, which is short for Marketing, Communications, and Public Affairs firm that represents climate solutions providers, wind, both onshore and offshore, battery storage, solar, PACE lending, and micromobility. And our job is primarily to help companies commercially succeed by increasing their deal flow and selling more stuff. And we also spend a significant amount of time making sure that they're treated fairly by the elected officials who have say-so over the pace of their growth. And then we also help companies get bought or go public. So the path that I took into representing the solar industry is essentially I went into politics for 10 years because I wanted to learn the intersection of media and politics and policy. And I spent about 10 years as an elected official's spokesman. And then I moved into the environmental and conservation movement where I was I was an institutional communicator for two successive groups. And along that way, I saw three big things. One of them is that we were saying no to certain things in the economy, and we did not have an alternative, a robust alternative to say yes to. We also did not have the mechanisms to deliver that alternative, I thought, with the momentum and the velocity that we should. And third, there was no pay forward mechanism on best practices for clean green communicators to stand on the shoulders of those who had come before them. And I started my firm, in essence, to address all three of those gaps. And here we are 16 years later. We've got 140 clients under our belt in 16 years, and we've got a staff that spreads across the country. And I think this is certainly the most enjoyable phase of my career, is working for these brilliant people who have amazing product ideas and really powerful executive teams.
Yeah, it's what a treat, right? And that's one of the things that I love about doing this show, honestly, Mike, is meeting people like you who are thought leaders in the industry, and people like Yann Brandt, who's your co-author on this article in PV Magazine. People know Yann best for Solar Wakeup Live. He does a podcast. He does a daily news chase down in his newsletter. And now he's the CFO of a battery storage integrator. But so, do you want to say anything else about Tigercomm or really what motivated you to start that venture? I get it. You're a mission-driven organization. Yes. And that's one of the things that I love about the solar industry, is that there are so many companies across the board, from manufacturers to installers to financiers, right, who are truly passionate for the energy transition and stopping climate change. So it really is a moment in history, Mike, where we have an inflection opportunity to create a softer landing for future generations, as I like to say. The landing will occur one way or the other, right? The future will unravel, and it's just a question of how much pain and suffering can be avoided.
Yes. The question is, will it unfold or will it unravel? And I think the good news here is that though we have dwindling time, we have also accelerating momentum to provide and scale the solutions that are going to address what is clearly the greatest existential crisis that humanity has ever faced. And I don't know if we're going to beat the clock or what clock it is we're going to be beating, but I do know that we have, the stakes could not be higher. And I think that what keeps me optimistic is that I, almost on a monthly basis, meet or talk to a person who's newly entered the clean economy sectors. That's how we define it. And these are people who are clearly very sharp and they very accomplished. They've done great things in their lives, and they're seeing this crisis unfold, and they're seeing that the way we solve it is in no small measure through commercial scaling of disruptive sectors.
Yes. So why should we be concerned about the soft costs of solar?
The short answer is because we're just leaving money on the table, so to speak. I mean that allegorically, and I also mean that literally. So we thought about this idea because if you look at how the election results turned out, we have about as narrowly divided a country as you can have, and you have the thinnest of margins of federal control. So we need to be looking for things that are, as we entitled the piece, are no-brainers, are clear benefits and cleanups of legacy practices, legacy drag coefficients. And when you have permitting inspection that's being done like it was being done decades ago, and yet we have all this technology, we just come through the last 12, 15, 16 months of experimenting how to do a lot of things better, faster through virtual means. It seemed to us that eliminating this source of costs was a clear clarion call. And that's because you have the following things that are real out in the country. First, you have cities and counties across America that are looking at yawning budget deficits, at least much thinner surpluses than they had before. You have a country that's starting to claw its way out of the worst economic hit since the Great Depression. And you have the need to get climate solutions traction accelerating. All three of those things makes eliminating legacy costs that are driven by antiquated permitting and inspection practices, getting them harmonized, getting them modernized, and making them more efficient. It seemed like it was a no-brainer to us.
Yeah, I mean, I work for a solar installer. We're a C&I installer. We don't do residential. And permitting for rooftop solar it's not rocket science, but there are many vagaries. Every jurisdiction has slightly different rules and costs affiliated with a solar project. And if it could just be the push of a button and, an installation within weeks, not months. A commercial solar project takes at least 6 months to bring out of the ground from soup to nuts, and oftentimes 12 to 18 months for commercial industrial. For residential, it's hopefully shorter. I'm learning as I go on the residential side, but then I noticed that we have colleagues in Australia and Germany with significantly lower soft costs and overall installation costs. In the United States, the cost of rooftop solar for residential is, say, $2.50 to $4 a watt solar, just as a reference. And that's a huge spectrum, which is quite telling. Yes, labor costs are different in different regions, and the cost of living is different in different regions. But honestly, this process of that a solar installer needs to go through with their customer could be shortened and simplified. And so you're suggesting, though, that if we're able to bring down the cost of solar we're going to we're going to inspire more people to invest in the clean economy?
I think more than that, we're going to employ more people in the clean economy, and the clean economy is going to produce more tax revenue because we're going to contribute to greater overall economic growth. Here's a way to think about this issue. Let's say you and I were going to look across the country at the thousands of jurisdictions that have their own permitting and inspection staff, protocols, and processes. To find the place where this idea won't work, the following things have to be true. One, their economy is growing too fast and they don't want to grow any faster. Number two, that local government, that local or state government has too much money and they don't want any more surplus. Number three, they are using practices that make limited staff go as far as they can possibly go, and there's no productivity gains to be had. How long do you think it would take you and I to go scour the country and find that jurisdiction? Be months.
Yes.
There is none. Like, there is no jurisdiction at the municipal, county, or state level where all those things are true. In fact, the opposite on all of them are true. Every state wants faster economic growth. They want more tax revenue. They want their workforces to go farther. And updating your practices does not mean you need to give away control or your authority and have it superseded. What we're saying is, if NREL has come up with better ways of doing this, we can kind of function, the Biden administration can kind of function like UL does. UL does not dictate what Fairfax County's fire code should be. It provides guidance. But if there was guidance provided, and happily there is, on how you can do this efficiently and quickly, and treat solar like the mainstream commodity it has become, like air conditioning units, like roofing, etc., we have an opportunity to upgrade the way we're doing this, particularly true for rural counties where you're much more cash strapped, you're trying to invigorate job growth. Here's an easy way to do that. Now, will the job growth be evenly distributed? No. Is it a game changer for towns and counties? It is not, but it is significantly additive, particularly when you look at the number of roofs in America that could host solar versus the number of roofs in America that are currently hosting solar. We are clearly at the bottom of a hockey stick on the most popular form of energy in America and the lowest cost form of new energy in America. And we know that there are, from research that LG did and publicized, there's somewhere between 50 and 80 million Americans who are part of families that are actively looking at going solar. That is a massive marketing opportunity. And so far be it from us to keep antiquated inspection and permitting practices standing in the way of that. It's just foolish.
Indeed. And you reference Rocky Mountain Institute and NREL, NREL's solar app in the article. So there are some very smart people that are analyzing how to make improvements in the permitting process for the solar industry, which I believe would open the floodgates, really, truly, if you can make it easier for residents and business owners and the installers across the board. And I completely agree that for rural communities, especially, this is a huge opportunity. Of course, every community wants economic growth and economic opportunity. We're all hurting from the pandemic right now and looking for anything to grab onto to revive our economy. And, you know, renewable energy, distributed generation is such a win-win, right? Because we're
Yes.
making the grid more resilient. We're actually improving lives. We're improving the health of humanity, and we're creating jobs and economic growth, which local governments need and the residents in those communities need. It's such a win-win-win. So go
Tim,
ahead.
think about this. We have 3,000 installers in America. They're helping 400,000 homeowners put solar on their roofs. And together they have to navigate the permission from 18,000 building departments. I mean, that level of complexity makes medieval Europe look like a monolith. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. So we're not, in no way are we suggesting that there be consolidation of permitting and inspection staffs. We're not asking one town or county to give up its autonomy to another. We're just saying, let's shine a light on the path to modernity, and let's invite and perhaps very publicly encourage these localities to get with the program.
Now, you've been in government, so you know how bureaucratic government can be sometimes. And change does not come easy to government at all levels, whether that's local, state, or federal. So it's one thing to have an awakening on the academic side, so to speak, at RMI and at NREL, and point out, okay, this is what we need to do to have a simpler, more efficient process. Now, sitting, wearing that hat though of a local building authority and a permitting authority, how do we convince them that this is not only going to be a really good thing for their community, but it's also going to work, so to speak, within their existing paradigm?
That's a great question. So one thing I've found in 35 years of being in and around government and elected politics from a communicator standpoint is that elected officials do not lead. They respond to pressure. And when they respond to pressure, there is a calculation that happens. It's this two-step calculation, very reliable. The first is that they have to know that the perceived political downside is small or manageable or non-existent. Then they can get to a political benefit calculation. And this is very important because I think in the renewable space, among my, a fairly small list of criticisms on how we've gone about engaging communities and engaging public policymakers, I think that we have gotten that wrong. We presented benefits, but we haven't taken away the fear. And here, the fear is really easy to handle. You have best-in-class national experts saying there are paths to modernize, number one. Number two, the modernization steps match how your permitting and inspecting work on other types of products and services. And the third, so we can handle those fears easily because, those who don't want to see solar scaling have done a pretty good job, particularly in the late aughts. They did a very good job raising doubts about the viability of clean energy technologies through Solyndra, through the Climate Gate, phony scandals. Solar was pulled into the culture wars, and we've had to spend the last 10 years pulling it back out of the culture wars. Now we're in this moment of national crisis that we're working to resolve. And here's a really bite-sized, easy thing that can take $1 a watt out of the cost and cut it out of the system. And mind you, these are costs where the cost of modules, balancing systems, racking, the inverter, labor put on it, fundamentally that cost, the soft cost, isn't going to anyone's pocket in the solar industry. It's purely an inefficiency of the entire ecosystem. So just, you think about that. This is not resolving the inefficiency, does not take money out of anyone's pocket. In fact, it puts the money in a bunch of people's pockets. So if we are agile about the way we can articulate the benefit and show that the reason for fear is not there, then we spin the wheel of government decision-making much more effectively.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned agility and fear. Uh, it's funny how quickly people do go to that place of, oh my God, they want to disrupt my industry, so to speak. um, and or they want to do something that's going to potentially harm my community, aka um, allowing for a lot more rooftop solar to happen in a community. That's kind of the bottom line here.
Yes.
And um, the thing that people I think don't realize is that the solar industry is quite mature. The technology has been around for
Yes.
70 years. And so this isn't rocket science. To the contrary, it really is like HVAC now. It's just not quite as common as HVAC, because we're still at the bottom of this hockey stick. You said we're on the curve. Absolutely, we're about to see, a major explosion of renewable energy in the United States. And we had a record year in 2020 with 20 gigawatts of installed solar. So, um, but I guess where do where do the solar professionals and other prosumers, so to speak, I guess, come in this? How do we affect change and convince authorities having jurisdiction that there is a better way?
That's a great question. One of the things that I don't think we talked in depth in the piece about, but we've talked a lot about in the post-publication podcast appearances, is the wonderful economies of effort and time that we can achieve by pursuing this idea as associations and as cross solar institutions. Because the things that we need to do to achieve this reform will require skill and capacity building that will pay us handsomely on the next 10 things that we want to go after. Let me give you an example. Jan is, in his platform, has done a really good job calling for what we call the NRA of solar. And what he really means by that is every time someone buys a gun in America, you are pretty much invited to join the NRA, because you've taken an action which then suggests that you might be inclined to join a group that advocates for other people to do what you just did. So what if we had a parallel effort, a similar effort that said, okay, Tim, you put solar on your rooftop, or your business has put a CNI installation on. Not only do we want to make sure that we harness your experience so that the next 10 people who want to do that in your community can do it, but we also want to make sure that your investment is protected, because we should not forget that several years ago, the Nevada Public Utility Commission, what we call the Christmas Eve massacre, kicked out the legs from underneath all these people who had not only put solar on the roof, but even the people who had committed to putting solar on the roof because of certain net metering rates. And it should not be up for debate that once you take a step of putting solar on your roof on a net metering rate, that gets taken away from you. So we have both a future promise and a constant threat that we can communicate to our solar customers. So everybody who goes solar in America today should be invited to sign up for the equivalent of the NRA for solar. And if we are data gathering and we are doing organizing in the right way, then we're creating a growing group of advocates for people to go solar in the most efficient and cost-effective way without having to do a down payment to legacy government practices that profit no one.
Yeah, I like that idea, an NRA of solar. So I'll think a little more about that. You brought up net metering, which also makes me think, Mike, that this is the soft costs of solar are just one of the challenges that we face. There's another significant challenge, and that is that utilities are fighting the industry tooth and nail in every market in the United States, including the most mature markets, California and Hawaii. And when you think about utilities, they are there for human safety and productivity. They exist for us. They are a service. But they are also regulated monopolies who can do what they want to do to some extent because they don't operate in a market driven economy. And that is a double edge because then uh, they take these positions against things like distributed generation, which they perceive as a threat, even though rooftop solar and storage is going to make the grid way more resilient
Yes,
and going to result in less financial strife on their part, which we see in Texas, right? The utilities in Texas are going bankrupt now from from the debacle a few weeks ago in February. If we truly had microgrids under every roof in every community, we wouldn't have the problems that we have in California and Texas and are going to
exactly.
continue to have.
Yeah. And, I wrote a piece in Recharge where I asked people, what do Greg Abbott, Rick Perry, and Tucker Carlson and a unnamed editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal have in common? And the answer is they're all part of the anti-reality crowd. They're the group of people who've been yammering for years that we don't have a global climate crisis, that clean energy isn't viable commercially as tracking the base load. And by the way, we would like your money to be shoveled at increasingly uneconomical forms of legacy energy, nuclear, coal, etc. The reality is that the legacy forms of energy are grossly subsidized. In other words, we shell out of our pockets enormous amounts of money to give these guys dirt cheap access to public property. We don't demand really much the way of security deposits for them. We have whole government bureaucracies devoted to making their lives easier to perform functions that really the private market should be performing. And we clean up after them. And now we're supposed to bail them out of trouble. And you see this, the grossest form is perhaps this $61 million bribery scandal in my home state of Ohio, where First Energy basically greased the palms of a lot of elected officials and powerful lobbyists in Columbus to engineer a taxpayer bailout of coal and nuke plants. Now, if the yammering from the anti-renewables crowd over the last decade and a half is to be taken on its face, so supposedly we are immature as an energy sector because we get policy support. Never mind the fact that we are the most popular form of energy in America by a long shot. Number two, by any measure, Americans overwhelmingly want policy support continuing to scale wind and solar. But if policy support is a sign of somehow adolescence or illegitimacy, what does it say about the coal and the nuclear industries that in coal's part, we're nearing 250 years. For oil's part, it's 150 years. For natural gas, it's like 100 years. So if these guys are still at the trough, and presence at the trough means you're immature, these are the oldest toddlers in the global economy. They're still walking around with diapers on because they still need us to clean up after them and shell out of our pockets to cap their wells and fix their pipeline messes and their well cap blowouts under the sea and all this stuff. So we have an opportunity to take an idea like cutting soft costs, which is very hard to argue against, and will benefit and put money in the pockets of a lot of people all over the political spectrum. And if we muster and concentrate our advocacy best practices on that task, we can accelerate our ability to achieve other things by achieving this thing.
Well, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that, about the momentum? And it's clear that we need to make the energy transition by 2035. Sooner would be better. The 350.org seems to have forgotten that we need to stay below 350 parts per million.
Yeah.
We're now in the 400s. Okay. How do we get back? It's not just about cleaning the grid, but actually reversing the damage that we've done to the atmosphere.
100%.
So when you think about the momentum, though, that builds from initiatives like this to reduce the soft cost of solar, I'm just curious, what do you think about?
I think I have a long list of particulars, and I've got a shorter list of larger principles. The challenge with being an economic disruptor within an industry that already is dominated by large, powerful incumbents is you have disruptor needs with disruptor budgets. You solve that by being intentional, proactive, ruthless in your tactical discipline, and over-invested in your public affairs success relative to your size. So in our writing, we do a lot of referring to what we call the clean economy mistake path. And this is something we've seen in a lot of sectors where their scaling is significantly affected by the choices of local public officials. This can be anything from the scooter and bike sharing companies to PACE lending, to building a wind farm, to getting permitted to put a utility scale or CNI level solar project in. And what we find consistently is that very few companies are founded by people who got out of bed one morning and said, hey, what I want to do is start a company, and its main mission is going to be to make politicians really happy with us. I've never found it. And we've worked with 140 of them. So I've got a fairly good running focus group here. And that's understandable, and that's okay, because people found companies to solve the problems of real people out in the world, not to get the blessings of elected officials. However, if we are exposed to local regulatory winds, we have to build our house to handle that wind speed. And what we find is that in sector after sector, successful engagement of public officials is an afterthought that they bolt on rather than a mandate to put in the business plan from the start. And that's okay. That's not a historical criticism. It is a reality that we want to point out so we can get our sectors playing catch up quickly. And here is a perfect opportunity to do that. We're basically saying we have a time of national leadership. We have large circumstances catalyzing a demand for change and an opportunity to build out our best practices and our structures for using those best practices. We can do that on something where there is very little drag coefficient on the argument and on the idea.
I mean, for me, to be honest, what I'd like to do is clone Larry Fink and Elon Musk. I think the question does beg why we don't see more charismatic leadership calling a spade and speaking truth to the circumstances that humanity finds itself in economically and sustainability wise or ecologically. So I like your holistic thinking there, Mike, very much. It truly is vital for our industry to think bigger and think more ambitiously about this as a movement that creates a bigger tent. We are divided in America largely because half of the population is low income and they don't see that the system is working for them, quote unquote. And so they want to throw it out. And the system really can work for them. I have strong ties to Scandinavia where the system really does work for the commoner. And education and healthcare are considered a right, not a privilege, the way they are here in the United States. And it shows. We are fat and unhappy here in the United States, and we're dying of COVID. Um, and it's a travesty. It doesn't have to be this way. We can write a better story for ourselves. So in the last few minutes that we have together, Mike, let's shine a light on what are the goods that are happening? You know, we have a great national organization in SEIA. We have great leadership now in the Biden administration, at least potentially. Jigger Shaw and Jennifer Granholm are in the DOE. What an amazing thing, right? What a
Yes,
breath of fresh air
yes.
those two individuals are for the clean economy. What else should people be able to speak to and go, well, this is happening, this is happening. The NRA of solar is now being established. I'm not sure what that is, if that's different than SEIA. So in your mind, what are the strengths that we're leaning on here?
So I think we have, I agree with you that our atmospherics right now have it feel very much like we have wind at our back, and it's good wind. And some of the people you rattled off are, I know quite well. Jennifer Granholm is a friend of mine and a former client of our firms. Jigger Shaw has been a friend and a mentor of mine for a number of years. And I know Abby Hopper very well. I think that if you're in the solar industry listening to this show, I'm posing to you a question. What part of your business plan is devoted to at least a limited set of actions to make your economic success known to the policymakers, particularly the local policymakers, make it known to them, because you are contributing tax money and job growth and economic value to your community. Are you taking steps to make sure that local officials who have some say-so over the pace of your growth, do they know about it? And I don't mean a one and done. This is a very forgetful time. I mean, if you think about, pre-pandemic, we were spending 5.7 hours a day on screens. The average American was. I'm sure that has gone north of 6 hours during the pandemic. We are bombarded with over 15,000 marketing messages a day as Americans. And the average American's attention span is south of 7 seconds. So are we being repetitive? Are we being disciplined? Are we being compelling in the way we're communicating this, so that the people who have effect on our fates, on the fate of our businesses, are they being reminded of what we're doing? Are they being engaged in the conversation about what we are doing and what we can do for the constituencies that they represent?
A scorecard, so to speak. Really, we all need to
Exactly.
have a scorecard so that we can effectively communicate with elected officials and other stakeholders at large. You know,
Yes.
it's not easy to understand the scale and scope of the clean energy industries or the clean tech industries. It's such a huge, such a ginormous opportunity economically for this country, and it doesn't further divide us. People like being empowered to have distributed generation. People like
Absolutely.
resiliency. Everybody would love to have a battery and a solar array once they understand what that gives them. And we have the technology. We just have to make it affordable and get outside the box, like Jim Spano is doing now in Texas with MyResi, with third party ownership of solar and storage projects, which is a really wonderful thing. Um, well, Mike, is there anything else our listeners should know about Tigercomm? I'm going to put your website on screen, and please tell our listeners how they can reach you.
Yeah, we're at Tigercomm with 2ms.us, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. All of the writing we have on our blog goes up on LinkedIn. We do try to come out with 3 or 4, I'd like to say, groundbreaking analysis a year. Put a lot of thought and time into them. So let us know what you think of the content we're putting out on behalf of the industry, because we've made a 16-year running investment in the success of this industry and the success of your company. Whether or not you ever give us a dime, it doesn't really matter. What matters to us is, are we, as a climate solutions sector or set of sectors, are we scaling up to our potential? both in speed and size? And I think right now the answer is no. And that's a pleasant problem to have. I should say, we're not the coal industry trying to manage the best in a locked in trajectory of contraction. We are a growth industry trying to manage questions of how fast we can grow. And these are questions that relate to how we can realize our very significant agency in the question of the speed of our growth. So we have the opportunity to grow, and we have the opportunity to have some say-so over the pace of growth. And we can do it by making relatively small percentages out of our business lines, our business plans. If we take a 5% investment as a local installer in letting local officials know what we do for them, if we do this in an engagement approach rather than just kind of a distribution approach, I think we can have some really significant benefits. So I think I would leave your listeners with this question. If you're an installer and you'd like to grow faster, you'd like profit margins to be higher, ask yourself if legacy permitting and inspection processes were modified so that they were much faster, we dropped away this cost, how much faster would your business grow? Viewed through that, what is the investment you're willing to make in a local chapter, of a pro solar organization, of investing more heavily in SEIA? I think you're going to see a really compelling invitation to do more and to grow faster.
Well said. I want to make a couple of quick announcements. You can find all of our content at the Solar Podcast here on our website at cesenergy.com/podcasts. I'm bringing you 2 of these interviews every week with people like Mark Kingsley, who is an industry veteran and the CEO of Alliant Energy, Derek Coburn at Lumencash, who is invented technology to make DC lighting mainstream, Erica Myers on the EV opportunity, Tom Tansey on cybersecurity and communications. Tom is going to be coming back soon to talk about this topic, reducing soft costs in the solar industry. And then me and John Weaver bring you a Clean Power Hour every Wednesday, where we chase down the latest solar storage and clean tech news. John is a journalist with PV Magazine and the Commercial Solar Guy. He is a solar installer and developer. So check it out at cesenergy.com. Please give our videos a thumbs up if you like it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and by all means, share it with your friends. I want to thank Mike Casey, the CEO of Tigercomm, for coming on the show. Have a wonderful day, everybody.